event tonight is a talk by Hasia Diner. And many of you know she is the professor of American Jewish history here at NYU. Because of the timing, I have a long introduction of Hasia. She's written very prolific. Many books have been published by Hasia. We have one book here on sale tonight for you, which is We Remember with Reverence and Love, and that will be on sale after the talk. But I'm going to cut short my introduction just to turn things over to Hasia. As you know, this was a collaborative effort with the gallery and the center here, because Melissa Ratcliffe, who's the curator of the show, was also a fellow here at our center and worked on the catalog when she was a fellow. Hasia Diner was also a fellow at our center, so this is a nice kind of synergy of fellowships and the curatorial coming together. So the format tonight is just that Hasia is going to go ahead and give her talk, and then we'll take questions from the audience, and we have a reception after that. And we're just very pleased you're all here this evening. Thank you.
Okay, well, I want to thank the Humanities Center and the Great Art Gallery for organizing this, and for all of you being here, including some of my students, which is always most wonderful to see them. So without any further ado, in 1952, the American Jewish Congress, which was then certainly in terms of the Jewish defense or national Jewish defense organizations, the one with the largest membership, called together a very small committee of a few Hebrew scholars, some poets, a couple of rabbis, one or two Jewish historians, and charged them with a task. They were asked to write a brief reading, a liturgical kind of text, in both English and Hebrew that would be used at people's Passover Seders in their homes and in community gatherings, to invoke the very recent destruction of European Jewry that we now call the Holocaust. And the committee did what they had been asked to do, and put together 3 paragraphs in English, 3 paragraphs in Hebrew. I couldn't tell from the archives if it was written first in English and then translated into Hebrew, or if it was written in Hebrew and then translated into English. Translations were pretty good with some minor divergences. But let me share with you the words of this text before going into my talk. So the text begins, as the title of my book invokes, "We remember with reverence and love the 6 million of our brothers of the European exile who died at the hands of a tyrant more wicked than the Pharaoh who enslaved our fathers in the land of Egypt. Come, he said unto his minions, let us cut them off from being a people, that the name of Israel be remembered no more. They slew the blameless and the pure, men, women, and children with vapors of poison and ovens and gas. But we will not dwell on the deeds of the evil ones, lest we defame the image of God in which man was created." There's the first paragraph. The second one was specifically pegged to the anniversary of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, which had taken place on Passover 1943. That paragraph was full of heroic images of Jewish history. It compared the fighters of the Warsaw Ghetto to Judah Maccabee of days of old, who brought glory and honor to the house of Israel. The final paragraph, what you might say, was aspirational, and the shortest of the 3 paragraphs, it read, "From their depths the martyrs raised their voice in a song of hope for a day when justice and brotherhood would reign among men." And those gathered were asked to rise and to sing the words of the Ani Ma'amin, I believe, the text taken from the medieval Spanish Jewish philosopher Maimonides. Okay, interestingly, in the Hebrew, the words "day of when justice and brotherhood would reign among men" was not in the text, was not present. So the writers of this text, which came to be called the Seder of Remembrance, hundreds of thousands of copies were distributed every year in the weeks before Passover through Jewish community centers, synagogues, Jewish organizations. It was reprinted in English language and Yiddish, translated then into Yiddish, and was printed in newspapers, had very wide usage. And the words of this Seder of Remembrance encapsulated much about how American Jews in the post-war period, from 1945 into the early 1960s, integrated the Holocaust in their communal lives. Metaphorically, across the nation, across ideology, across language, across age, class, and place of origin in Europe or even the Ottoman Empire, American Jews participated in building a culture, text by text, artifact by artifact, and political act by political act, which gave the Holocaust a prominent place. When they gathered in their Jewish spaces and when they faced the larger American public, they invoked the all too horrendous devastation which had taken place in Europe. Okay, they did this, and as such undermines one of the most persistent themes, a persistent statement in American and American Jewish history, which says that the Jews of the post-war period had nothing to say about the Holocaust, that they shut it out of their communal consciousness and had to wait until the events of the late 1960s to be able to engage with it. Indeed, even the beautiful catalog, which goes along with the exhibit at the Great Gallery, refers to the post-war period as a time, quote, when the Holocaust had not yet surfaced, okay, in American consciousness. So my talk, to some degree, is a kind of cautionary note to those who would make that statement. So what did they call this event that we now call the Holocaust? Well, they employed a range of words to connote it. Hitler's dark reign of terror, Hitler times, the catastrophe with a lowercase c, the catastrophe with a capital C, the Great Catastrophe, the Hitler catastrophe, the 6 million. These words got used along with the concentration camps, our recent tragedy, and many others. In their publications, the printed programs of communal events, the curricula of schools, sermons, speeches, and press releases, they used all of these words interchangeably without investing much meaning in one word versus another. So, for example, the program notes of a concert of Jewish music performed in Chicago in 1953 by the Halevi Society identified the poet Mordechai Gebertig as someone whose lullaby, Yankele, which they would be singing as, quote, a victim of the crematorium. In 1954, a study guide published by the B'nai B'rith entitled, What Do You Know About Jewish Religion, History, Ethics, and Culture, all in about 53 pages, referred to Hitler's, quote, ghastly program of extermination. So all sorts of ways to define it. The word Holocaust, contrary, again, to what many have asserted, did get used in these years, with or without a capital H, and with or without some kind of modifier before the word Holocaust. So in 1949, the Jewish Museum mounted a retrospective exhibit on the work of the painter Abraham Wolkowitz, a painter of the early 20th century New York, and the brochure for that the museum handed out to museum goers said, quote, a half century has passed, and these children, as were depicted in Wolkowitz's work, have become grandparents. They have witnessed the Nazi Holocaust, lowercase h, which threatened the very existence of the Jews. So the word Holocaust was out there and part of the public discourse. In Yiddish, as in English, the press, the poets, the novelists, the host of radio stations, radio shows, the orators, the survivors who spoke at annual gatherings, those who compiled the hundreds of Yizkor B'Yichur memorial books, which recalled the histories and deaths of so many East European Jewish communities at the hands of the Nazis also seized upon no single word to trump all others. Hitlerzeiten, Hitler times, was quite common. The Horben, the destruction. Okay, that's the destruction, plain and simple, but also the letzter Horben, the most recent destruction, unser größer Horben, our great destruction, Horben Europa, the destruction of Europe, and a few times even der dritter Horben, the third destruction, making, implying or saying very directly that the destruction of European Jewry at the hands of the Nazis was as transformative to Jewish life as the destructions of the temple in Jerusalem in ancient times. Whatever they called it, and in whatever language they used, they posed the catastrophe in both deeply Jewish and broadly universal terms. The writers of the Seder of Remembrance not only referred to this tragedy as ours and used the pronoun us and we, but also envisioned a day in the future when justice and brotherhood would reign among men. American Jews in this period found numerous times and places and ways to publicly express their anguish over this horrendous reality, devoting much of their communal rhetoric and institutional programming to speculating on its history. Why did it happen? How could it have happened? Contemplating its impact on their lives in the present, and speculating on how it might shape their future. Talk of the tragic fate of the 6 million permeated all the different strands of American Jewish life. Reform, Orthodox, Conservative, and Reconstructionist Jews, despite their fundamental differences about Judaism as a religious system, all made room for it in their synagogues, seminaries, and publications, as well as in the pedagogical materials for their school children. They did so differently, but they did so nonetheless. American Zionists of every variant also employ the Holocaust in their organizational work, as did Jews in the left-leaning world, for example, represented by something like the Jewish People's Fraternal Order, a offshoot of the International Workers' Order. The B'nai B'rith, the Jewish War Veterans, the Jewish Labor Committee, and I could go on and on. All of these organizations, institutions, charitable, political, cultural, all recalled the 6 million and contemplated in the aftermath of the slaughter, contemplated it, and did so, though, in ways that fit who they were. They constructed a repertoire of words and deeds that took as their inspiration the calamity of the 6 million. While all of these organizations, institutions, the members, the leaders, their newsletters, and so on, disagreed profoundly about Jewish culture and Judaism, and they disagreed among themselves as to what Jews, as Jews and Americans, ought to do with the impact of as Jews and Americans, the impact of the Holocaust. They agreed, however, that it had permanently shaped them. Some, like several of the artists whose work are represented at the Great Gallery, particularly those associated with the March Group, put words on paper conveying emotion, fact, and ideas through artwork, others through oratory and sermons. Some crafted liturgies for synagogues and homes, fashioning a vast, unorganized, chaotic, spontaneous, and amorphous memorial project which sought to keep alive the image of Europe's murdered Jews. Some American Jews on their own or under the auspices of Jewish institutions chiseled references to it on stone. Others turned to music, recording and performing a repertoire of works which stood for the Holocaust. Those able to created dances, dramas, pageants, poems, scholarly work, and graphic images, or organized public events which took as their theme something about the Jews who had perished at the hands of the Nazis. Larger numbers, vastly larger numbers, watched, listened, read, and by this consuming the text, they made the catastrophe organic to American Jewish life. So in thinking about how the Holocaust did in fact surface at least among American Jews, and we'll see that it wasn't just among them, much of this was about remembering pure and simple. That is, they believed one ought to remember, they did remember, and then sought ways to put those emotions and ideas into some kind of text, some kind of artifact that would stand for the calamity that had just happened. Let me give one example, and as I go on, for a number of the themes, I'm going to say, you'll hear that same phrase, let me give just one example, and just know that behind the one example is a kind of vast compendium of other examples I could have chosen. So in 1949, the dancer Sophie Maslow premiered a work at the 92nd Street Y, which was then the sort of key place for modern dance. And it was a dance based on the short stories of Shalom Aleichem. You're all familiar with him as the author of the Tevye the Milkman, which became then later on Fiddler on the Roof. And so theoretically, this had nothing to do with the Holocaust. These were people who'd lived 70 years earlier. But yet the program notes for Maslow's dance said that this dance is dedicated to the memory of the 6 million. And so that if you had attended that dance, there it would have been in your program. But much of what American Jews did and said about the calamitous era of Hitler times went beyond pure memorialization, but rather sprang from very specific political and communal concerns. So first, as the shareholders in the largest, wealthiest, most unfettered, politically robust, and institutionally elaborate Jewish community in the world, they alone had many practical tasks beyond remembering the victims, although they hoped that by remembering the victims, they could shoulder the chores which had fallen on their shoulders. They, and pretty much they alone, raised the millions of dollars to aid the survivors in the immediate years after the war. Only American Jewry had the financial resources to support the remnant of European Jewry, and in the years that the survivors needed assistance, vast sums flowed for these projects. It's still estimated that the money collected between 1945 and 1952, when the government of West Germany began to pay restitution, that in those 6 years, those 6 years represent the single largest philanthropic undertaking in human history, and that at no time have so few, because we're talking about a community of about 5 million, collected so much money in such a short span. So the era of the post-war period, even after 1952, was a place or a time of vast amounts of fundraising to aid the survivors. Indeed, the aid was undertaken through an arm of the United Jewish Appeal, and it went under the letters SOS, Save Overseas Survivors. And wherever one lived in the American Jewry, from Waukesha, Wisconsin to New York City, to Kansas City, to Seattle, and every place in between, the community was in full gear to save overseas survivors. So again, there is so much that could be offered as an example of this, and I'll take one that, looking out at the audience, I think will resonate to some of us over a certain age. And this was a television show that was very popular in the 1950s called This Is Your Life. I assume people remember This Is Your Life. Ralph Edwards was the host. It was sponsored by Hazel Bishop. And every week, an unsuspecting individual was somehow dragooned onto the stage, and people would come out from behind the curtain saying, we went to elementary school together. Do you remember when, we did whatever, we picked, the flowers that we weren't supposed to, we threw a water bottle at the teacher. So it was a very popular show. In May 1953, the the honored guest of This Is Your Life was a woman named Hanna Koner, who was from Czechoslovakia and had been interned in Theresienstadt. So the half hour of This Is Your Life retold not only her childhood and her teenage years before the Nazi takeover of Czechoslovakia, but also chronicled by means of people who had been with her, her ordeal in Theresienstadt. Hazel Bishop, the sponsor, announced at the beginning of the program that it would have no commercials, but all the money that it would have spent on commercials was going to go to the United Jewish Appeal to save overseas survivors. So fundraising and political action for the survivors made remembering the Holocaust impossible, and the story of the Holocaust, in larger or smaller measure, was told repeatedly to get people, Jews and non-Jews, to dig into their pockets to give for the saving remnant. Secondly, the Jews of the United States, the nation which emerged from World War II as the West's unmatched economic and political power, spent much energy on making sure, and usually unsuccessfully, reminding the world that it had been Germany which had perpetrated this crime against the Jewish people. American Jewish communal bodies drew attention both to the evil deeds perpetrated in the years from 1933 to 1945, but monitored and protested as they could, informing the American public and the American government about the supposed rehabilitation, and rehabilitation was always in quote marks, okay, of former Nazis and their re-entry into public life in West Germany. So in 1955, Adolf Held, who was the chair of the Jewish Labor Committee, sent an impassioned letter of protest to Secretary of State John Foster Dulles. The letter was then issued also as a press release, reprinted in the New York Times, Washington Post, LA Times, and so on. He wanted to inform Dulles about the presence of vendors who sold, quote, outspoken Nazi literature at the Frankfurt Book Fair. And this is Held. We are deeply shocked that our government has not publicly protested to the fact that there are more than 20 West German publishing firms which issue almost exclusively memoirs of former leading Nazis, literature glorifying the barbarous acts of the Nazis. Held went on to tell Dulles that, quote, the death stench of the 6 million Jews who perished in the concentration camps has not yet evaporated from the memories of those who have survived. Now, there's obviously a tremendous error in there because 6 million Jews did not die in the concentration camps. Okay? The number was much smaller. Most of the deaths took place elsewhere, but the imagery was so potent. It's also notable that a number of American cities in the 1950s participated in the Sister City program, where they adopted some city in another country to be engaged in cultural and economic exchange. And several cities with large German populations, Cincinnati, Milwaukee, St. Louis, chose cities like Munich, okay, as their sister city. And every time this was announced, the local Jewish community, through organizations like the American Jewish Congress, the Jewish Community Council, the Anti-Defamation League, went into high gear to tell the city council and the mayor of Milwaukee, Cincinnati, St. Louis, pick another city. Why should you choose, said the head of the Jewish Community Council of Cincinnati, why should you choose the city that was the birthplace of Nazism, meaning Munich? So that was a second reason to keep telling that story, in order to make sure that American public opinion and the American government were conscious of the fact of Germany's evil deeds. So too, many of the political issues of the post-war period, from the end of World War II into the early 60s, the kind of high point of American liberalism, came to be opportunities for American Jews on the national and the local levels to retell the story of what had happened to the Jews in Europe at the hands of the Nazis. So the flowering of the American Civil Rights Movement was indeed one such opportunity for them. It was beyond the scope of a talk tonight, and a phenomenon in which they participated, and which, despite their own evolving middle-class status and whiteness, spoke to them profoundly. And when they spoke about American Civil Rights Movement, they consistently twinned it to the Holocaust. Of the many, many examples that I could offer, the one that got the greatest hearing, not just to those assembled on August 28, 1963, on the grounds between the Lincoln Memorial and the Washington Monument, but those all over the United States and around the world watching the Great March on Washington, at which Martin Luther King made his iconic speech, "I Have a Dream." The speaker before King was Rabbi Joachim Prinz, who represented American Jewry. He was the president then of the American Jewish Congress and a rabbi from Newark, New Jersey. So he preceded King. He was the speaker right before King. And we might say that his speech, beamed around the world, could have been entitled, "I Have a Nightmare." When I was the rabbi of the Jewish community in Berlin under the Hitler regime, I learned many things. The most important thing that I learned was that bigotry and hatred are not the most urgent problem. The most urgent problem, the most disgraceful, the most shameful, the most tragic, is silence. So too, the anti-communism of the post-war period provided American Jews, not necessarily those on the far left, obviously they had a very different view, but the majority, to, once again refer to the Holocaust and to do it in a way that was consistent with American fears of the Soviet Union and of communism. So in the 1953 volume of the American Jewish Yearbook, Lucy DeWittowitz, an outspoken anti-communist, noted that she perceived widespread anxiety over the fate of the Jews in the Soviet Union and behind the Iron Curtain. And as she put it, quote, "With the memory of Nazi Germany's murder of 6 million Jews fresh in their mind, American Jews in the main are convinced that only a tremendous worldwide protest will stop further development of anti-Semitic campaigns." Many other of the hot issues of the post-war period provided moments in political time or political liberal time for American Jews to talk about the Holocaust to the American public. Probably the most significant one, or in terms of American politics, was the various issues surrounding the Genocide Convention. So just to briefly identify that, Raphael Lemkin was a Polish Jewish journalist who made it to the United States in 1940, and he had been interested in the concept of genocide since the 1920s, as he, as a young lawyer, had learned about the Armenian genocide. And so he spent the 20s, 30s thinking about it, and obviously by the end of the 30s, it was becoming very palpable. He escaped to the United States, made it here in 1940, although he lost his entire family. When he arrived in the United States, he came almost immediately to the attention of the American Jewish Committee, which essentially paid his salary from 1940 until his death in 1962. And over the course of these years, Lemkin wrote a document which we know as the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide. He brought it to the first General Assembly of the United Nations after the war. And the idea was that the General Assembly would pass this, and then, it would be passed, it would be presented to every country in the world, and these governments from the top of the alphabet to the bottom would pass this and sign on to the assertion that genocide is a crime against humanity. Okay, notably, one of the last countries to sign it, or to pass it, was the United States. Okay, so it did not pass the Genocide Convention until 1989, and although it came up numerous times, it came up in 1950, right after the United Nations passed it. It was obviously very embarrassing that the Soviet Union passed it, and the United States didn't. It came up in 1950. It came up in the mid 50s. It came up in the late 50s. It came up in the early 60s. And beyond. And whenever the Genocide Convention came up in front of the United States Senate, American Jewish organizations went into high gear. The National Federation of Temple Sisterhoods, the organization of women in the Reform movement, in each one of those campaigns, sent hundreds of thousands of postcards to all of their members saying, send this to your senator. Okay, asking your senator to vote yes on the Genocide Convention, write to your senator, urge upon the United States Senate ratification of the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide. And the postcard also went on to note that Lumpkin had authored this, and the Temple Sisterhood women could sign on to adopt this little postcard, which also said, who better than a Jew can understand the awful catastrophe which can result when any nation sets out on a path to wipe out whole communities and peoples? We support this after viewing the ruins wrought by the Nazi Holocaust and witnessing the wholesale murder of 6 million Jews. It was 1956. Indeed, in 1950, when the first time the Genocide Convention came up, Jacob Blaustein, who was president of the American Jewish Committee, Lumpkin's patron, said to the senators sitting there representing of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, he said, I am appearing on behalf of the American Jewish Committee. We are concerned with genocide not only because 6 million Jews were recently murdered, but also because genocide is a crime against humanity, which the civilized world must eradicate. So the storytelling of the story of the Holocaust was to aid survivors. It was to keep Germany's feet to the fire. It was to advance the post-war liberal agenda. And it was also used by American Jewry across the board as a vehicle to act for and advocate for the creation of a Jewish homeland in Palestine, for the state of Israel, and to then enlist support for it from the United States. So again, there's so many voices that I could enlist to just encapsulate that kind of thinking. And so I want to use the words of because nobody I've spoken about so far came from the world of American Orthodoxy. So I want to quote here Isaac Lewin, a professor at Yeshiva University, who wrote a series of articles in the late 1940s, 1948, 49, in one of the Yiddish newspapers, and bundled them together into a book called Noch the Churban, or After the Destruction. And in this book, Lewin postulated how the emergence of a sovereign state for the Jewish people had made this Churban different than others. This one, he said, constituted, quote, the greatest destruction of Jewish history, but created the reality of Jewish sovereignty. And then he went on. When the mourning for the 6 million martyrs had hardly begun, the Jewish people have taken up for itself the task for which there is no precedent, to build a home in Israel. Without help from the outside, the old wandering nation has come back to its home. He then went on to say that the wild beasts, obviously the Germans, did not leave behind even the smallest reminder of their victims. But perhaps, he said, that mattered less now because, quote, the Jewish people can put up a memorial marker in their new home. Let the new settlements be named for the martyrs. Let the streets of Jerusalem, Tel Aviv, and Haifa, and all the other cities of Israel be the memorial markers for the ripped away sons and daughters of our people. Now, in all of this, little of what American Jews did and said and produced about the Holocaust, whether remembering it for its own sake or for deriving contemporary political lessons from it, none of this existed in a hermetically sealed Jewish world. When and where they could, they shared it with their American neighbors. What their American neighbors did with it was obviously beyond their control, but they did it nonetheless. Notably, when books came out, were published, The Diary of Anne Frank in 1952, in 1956, Gerda Weissman-Klein's All But My Life, the memoir of a young woman who'd survived Auschwitz, and other books like that. When these books would come out in English, local Jewish community organizations would buy up hundreds of copies of the book and then work with public librarians and with public school libraries to place these on the shelves so particularly that young people could read them. The Jewish organizations argued, should the Diary of Anne Frank go into a elementary school library, or was it for junior high school? But the point was, it had to be there for others to read. So American Jews wanted their American non-Jewish neighbors to know about this, and I'm going to encapsulate this in just a very ordinary person. I guess we're all ultimately ordinary, but who happened to have written a letter to the editor of the Boston Globe, and somebody happened to have clipped it and put it in an archival file, and I got to read it because I would have never looked in the Boston Globe to find this. So his name was Mr. H. Kudlowitz. I indeed don't even know what the H stands for. And he was the principal of a Yiddish language school, the Yud Lamed Peretz Arbiter School in Dorchester, Massachusetts. And he felt compelled to speak out about the Holocaust in the local press. So in 1959, he wrote an enraged letter to the editor of the Boston Globe, which got published. I want to read his words in full, although it's quite brief, just to indicate not only American Jewry's widespread memorialization of the Holocaust, to indicate that it indeed had surfaced, but the intensity of its interest in having that story told widely and correctly. So I'm going to read Mr. Kudlowitz's letter, and in the letter is a quote from the original Boston Globe article that he was responding to, and so I'll probably use air quotes. So, to the editor, I am writing to tell you of a drastic error which appeared in the May 4 Globe in the article covering the Warsaw Ghetto Memorial. It was printed, and then here's now the quote from the May 4 Globe. Children of the I.L. Peretz Arbiter School lighted the candles, and later, a reading in German gave a portrayal of life in the ghetto and the massacre by the Nazis. And that's the end of the quote from the May 4 Globe. Now back to Mr. Kudlowitz. In the first place, your reporter should have inquired as to the language used if it were unfamiliar to him. Second place, it should have been apparent to the writer that whatever language would have been used, it certainly wouldn't have been German. This was a memorial observance paying tribute to the 6 million Jews who died at the hands of the German Nazis. Therefore, it would seem incongruous to sing the praises of the martyred Jews in the German language. The children of the I.L. Peretz School rendered their portrayal in Yiddish, the language used by the Jews of Eastern Europe, and taught at the school itself. The kind of clincher then at the end. Can I imagine it? Since the appearance of your article, our school has received numerous phone calls protesting our use of German in the program. We would appreciate a retraction of your error. And I do not know if they ever published the retraction. So American Jews did not shrink from letting the non-Jewish public know about the Holocaust or how deeply they felt about it. After all, someone in the school had to have told the Globe about the upcoming program because the I.L. Peretz School in Dorchester, a very humble working-class community, was certainly not on the main heartbeat of Boston news. And it was not the Boston Marathon. And so somebody at the school had to have informed the paper that this ceremony was going to take place. Okay, a final point about the role of the Holocaust in American Jewish life in the period when supposedly they wouldn't talk about it at all. American Jews in the period after the war, the leaders among them in particular, was involved in a crusade, in an attempt to make American Jews more Jewish as a memorial, they said, to the 6 million. The Holocaust was used to just tell by the leadership, Reform, Orthodox, conservative, Zionist, secular, artists, writers, educators, journalists, that the Holocaust had destroyed the mainstream of Jewish life. It had uprooted, it had decimated the sources of Jewish intensity, authenticity, and creativity. And now that task, the task of creating Jewish culture, had fallen on the extremely weak shoulders of American Jews. So in 1949, the Hebrew Union College, just down the street here, although I think it was there already at the time, however, had a big ceremony at Carnegie Hall to announce the opening of the School for Sacred Music, the Reform Movement's first cantorial institute. And Nelson Gluck, the president of Hebrew Union College, got up and said, "The Nazi horde destroyed the wellspring of Jewish music and Jewish creativity. It is now our sacred duty to pick up where they so violently were forced to leave off." Okay, and then the New York Philharmonic played at this grand event at Carnegie Hall. Or in 1948, historian Simon Ravidovich delivered the inaugural lecture at the opening of Chicago's College of Jewish Studies. He called upon the listeners, the students, faculty, notable guests, including the presidents of the University of Chicago, of the city's Catholic universities, Loyola and DePaul, the president of Northwestern, which still had quotas against Jewish students, and the school's backers all sitting in the audience. He called upon them to remember, quote, that our brethren in the Polish ghettos under Hitler kept up the traditional idea of Jewish learning. The way they learned, youth and aged, up to the last moments of their lives, until they were thrown into the gas chambers, will stand forever as one of the most glorious pages in our history. This should be our unforgettable lesson everywhere for all times. The implication couldn't have been clearer. If Jews could keep studying Jewish texts in the death camps, then surely they could and should in Chicago. So I want to draw this to a close and say that in this post-war period, as American Jewry, fragmented by class, by ideology, by language, by place of origin in Europe, by geography, where they lived, all agreed that the Holocaust had made them, that it had shaped their world, and that it was their obligation to remember it for both the sacred task of remembering, but also to reshape the world that had been left in its wake. They did this with no precedent. They had no recent examples to follow of how to do it. They had no domestic partners. That is, no other ethnic group in America at that point in time had created some massive monument and public space, organized museums, university courses, held annual public gatherings to commemorate painful tragedies perpetrated elsewhere. American Jews had to embark upon this on their own, and not surprisingly, they fought quite bitterly among themselves as to what constituted a fitting memorial. They had no authority structure. They had no central organization which told them what to do and how to do it. Each community, each group, each segment of American Jewry did it on their own. In New York, by the way, in the late 40s and early 50s, there were at least 5 different Warsaw Ghetto memorial programs, all held on the same day, because they differed as to what the focus of that program should be. Although when you look at the programs, they're exactly the same. But they each had to do it themselves because they didn't like the way the other one was doing it. So in that anarchic environment, no one opposed recalling the victims of the Holocaust, aiding the survivors, pointing out the evil of the perpetrators, or trying to imagine a better America, a better world, and a better Jewish future. They disagreed with how to do it, but they never disagreed on the basic premise that Jewish communal institutions, schools for the young, summer camps for the kids, seminaries which trained rabbis, the Jewish press, the multiplicity of organizations, philanthropic, cultural, political, and religious, all had a share in remembering the 6 million and using that memory to shape the post-war world. They had no idea what constituted the best memorial, but all experimented in their own way to try to find out, and then went about the process of building it. Thank you.
Hi. I was wondering, what is the origin of the myth that it never actually reached American Jewish consciousness, and how did you end up coming to the project?
Okay, that's a great story. Okay, so the first part of the question, did everyone hear the question?
Yes.
So what I call the myth of silence begins to develop in the late 60s as part of the sort of countercultural movement bubbling from the bottom up of young Jews finding everything, like many young Americans at the time, finding everything wrong with their parents' generation, with the generation of the 50s, that age of consensus, that age of conformity. And young American Jews began in a lot of underground publications and then not so underground saying, our parents or our synagogues or our summer camps withheld this story. They never talked about it. Okay. And, they also made other kinds of statements that, in fact, were just not true. But over time, those young people came to be academics and rabbis and community leaders, and they brought that same narrative with them into their professional lives. By the 1980s, that story and that kind of myth of silence, or the statement of silence, came also to be used for some very, actually by the 70s, two very different political purposes. So on the one hand, those individuals within the American Jewish world who were more religiously oriented, more assertive ethnically, very much identified with Israel, create a kind of story that says until the victory of Israel in 1967, American Jews lived as shallow, obsequious assimilators, and it was the war, the 67 war in the Middle East, that brought them in essentially out of their closet. It allowed them to now have something to be proud of. On the other side of the equation, critics of Israel, and American Jewry's, shall we say, political engagement with Israel, also took the same position, but from a very different angle, and said, until the late 60s, American Jews really didn't care about Israel. And it was, it's not that they were opposed, but it wasn't a burning issue. It's kind of lower on their agenda. But only when Israel rose to the top of the agenda did they, and Norman Finkelstein put it very well. He said they began to not use the Holocaust, but misuse it. And that was his contention, to support Israel. Okay, so that it was never about, he says, the museum and the books, never really about the Holocaust. It was about Israel, and the Holocaust was a vehicle by which to make a contemporary political statement. Okay, in a sense, once the story is out there, it kept getting reinscribed over and over and over again. So then the question of how I got to this, it's got maybe an academic lesson, I don't know. So in the, must have been the late 90s, I was approached by an editor from Houghton Mifflin to write the blurb, which is now, I guess, even a verb. You're blurbing somebody, which I find really strange, but to write the blurb for Peter Novick's book called The Holocaust in American Life. And Novick, who falls into that category of he had kind of nothing but contempt for American Jewry of the late 20th century, and its, again, involvement with Israel and its use of the Holocaust and so on. The first third of the book was historical. And he says, nobody talked about it. It was a taboo topic. It was buried in the subconsciousness. And he said, and when Jews talked about it, it never went beyond the dining room table. Okay, and so I'm reading the book because I'm supposed to write the blurb, and my immediate reaction is, this isn't right. Okay, now, why did I think it was not right? So, again, a lesson for the graduate students in the back. On the one hand, one's personal recollections are pretty specious as the basis for history, but they can be the spring-off point. And so I remembered first that in my hometown, which I found out later was just very typical, had one of these Warsaw Ghetto memorial programs. And every year, I was the child orator. Okay, and I did the Hebrew and Yiddish reading, including the We Remember with Reverence and Love. And every year the mayor was there, and the city's 2 congressmen, and everybody was the same 3 guys. And they said, oh, what grade are you in now? And so clearly it wasn't just the dining room table, because there were the 3, shall we say, chief city political figures. Novick talked about how he says there was no effort to include the Holocaust in liturgy. Well, I have to say, I can't remember how many years I sat in a conservative synagogue on Yom Kippur, and I don't know if it was out of boredom or whatever, reading ahead. And there in the Yom Kippur service of the Martyrology, this lengthy, gruesome description of the execution by the Romans of 10 rabbis in the Roman period, the conservative prayer book, which was issued in 1951, had a full-page reading called "To Our Beloved 6 Million." So obviously it had been incorporated into liturgy. And I also had these deep memories of summer camp, where perhaps, I don't know what psychologists would say about it, but we kind of reenacted some of these gruesome events, one time at a model concentration camp. And so, again, whatever the meaning of, the impact was, I don't know. But it was clearly very much part of lived life. And so I obviously declined to write the blurb. So I just can't do this. But I thought it was worth an article to just see what I could, in terms of taking on Novick. And I spent one summer and ended up with a new 4-drawer file cabinet of what I found. And said, this isn't an article, that there's a very complex story about how a group of people with, again, on their own, okay, try to figure out what's a fitting memorial. So that's kind of the story, that perhaps longer than you had wanted.
Thank you for that. So you talked about how unprecedented amount of money was raised. You didn't talk about where that went so much, and the politics behind that, between Israel resettling within Europe, or were there in this period many Jewish groups who were pushing for more the refugees and survivors to come over here?
Okay,
if you could elaborate.
Okay, so that's actually 2 questions, because it's both the money and then it's the question of the political action of American Jewry vis-a-vis the displaced persons. Yeah. Okay, so the money went, from 1945 until the DP camps began to empty out in 52, most of the money went to the DP camps. Okay, and basically the Jewish displaced persons were supported by American Jewry. It also went to those Jewish communities outside of the DP camps, where Jews were trying to rebuild communal life in Poland, in Italy, in Austria and Germany, so that as Jews began to resettle these places, and it was American money that made that possible. The money then also does flow to Israel. For those who were able to get there. Again, it becomes a little different after the German, work of the Claims Conference, where then Germany took responsibility. And again, the American Jewish organizations play a very powerful role in getting that deal made with for Germany to pass that, for the German government to pass that. Now, the question about the DPs and immigration to the United States, that is, rather than to Israel. So the bulk of American Jewish organizations said the survivors should go wherever they want. Okay, it's whatever they would like. They were very eager to have them come to the United States. And from what we know, most of the survivors wanted to come to the United States. In one of the DP camps, residents, plotted the streets, and they named them New York and Chicago. So it was clear that America was really the goal. But then they came up at loggerheads with the United States government, which had very strict quotas. And even with President Truman's executive order in 1945, and then the Displaced Persons Act of 48 and 50, Jews were a minority of those who got entry into the United States. The Zionists wanted that way. The Zionists did not want them to come to the United States. And they said, look, these are the natural settlers, as it were, or Israel is the natural place for them to go. And so there was just a very ugly war of words between the Zionists, and again from 45 on, and the Joint, the American Jewish Joint Distribution Committee, and then the UJA, and so on. So it was not without conflict. But certainly for the mainstream Jewish organizations, they would have been very happy for them to come to the United States, and it was viewed actually as a potentially very positive development. And so, actually, I should also say that the money is spent when survivors would come to the United States. The UJA through HIAS, the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society, and then local communities, the Jewish Family and Child Services in Milwaukee, or the Combined Jewish Philanthropies of Boston, would, however many families would come to Milwaukee, Boston, Chicago, Washington, they would pay their rent for a year and got them set up so that they could get started in the United States, clothing, setting up their apartments, finding them jobs. So all of this, none of this is free, and so that's where the money went.
Thank you for your talk. The outpouring of Holocaust memorials that seems to begin in the 70s and 80s and just continues on. Is that do you see that as a response to the myth of silence, or do you see it as coming out of a different set of influences?
Okay, so first, the memorials really begin earlier, and they just took a different form. And so if you go up to Riverside Park, I believe it's in the 70s, there was to be a large marble monument there. There was actually a competition, and there was a huge ceremony to lay the cornerstone for this. Now, it never got built. The Parks Commission killed it. But for several years, every year there was the first anniversary of laying of the cornerstone, the second anniversary of laying of the cornerstone, so that there were efforts to build memorials. Again, let me just give you one example. When Lincoln Center was to be opened, the American Jewish Congress and Hadassah, so it's the Women's Zionist organization, came up with this idea that there should be a special room. Now, obviously, you're looking quizzical because it never happened, but that there should be a special room at Lincoln Center that would be a library dedicated to the Jews who perished, and it would house the books that were then available to on the subject. Clearly never happened, but there were memorials that were in cemeteries, in synagogues. So the memorialization begins very local and then moves onward. So, but your question is still a very good one. Why does the American government, both on a national and then locally, begin to do this in I'd say in the 80s, when it wouldn't do it, in the 40s, 50s, 60s? And I think it's such a big question, and I'm going to try to answer it, but also slightly beg off, because I was really interested in that earlier period. And so this is kind of more a matter of speculation. But I think in an age where so many Americans pressed for recognition of their specific, particular group needs and group tragedies and group traumas, which we could sometimes call this, ethnic politics or identity politics. Jews were there as well. Yeah, so it has a certain competitive to it, and it's a kind. And again, Novick said this is all a testament not to how much Jews cared about the Holocaust, but it was a testimony to Jewish political clout. Okay, and so there's a very complicated story about building the museum in Washington. And, basically Jimmy Carter had a Jewish problem because he had made feelers to the PLO. And his ambassador to the UN, Andrew Young, had met with an official of the PLO. And so Jewish organizations went bad about this. And so Stuart Eisenstadt, who was one of his chief advisors, somebody he had known from Atlanta, said, this is a way to placate a very very unhappy group. Okay, now it's obviously more complicated than that, but it gets very much caught up with late 20th century politics in terms of identity politics, but also Jews as a political group wanting to have their trauma, who they were recognized and acknowledged by the larger society.
Thank you. Just a brief question. Where's your hometown?
Milwaukee.
Okay, that's very interesting because I actually believe the myth of, I live the myth of silence. My parents escaped Germany in 1939. Mm-hmm. The rest of my family didn't. They died in Treblinka. My father he was a professor there. He became a cantor here, a chazan, right? Mm-hmm. We never had this thing by the American Jewish Congress. We never knew about it, the Seder of Remembrance. And my father we read every single paragraph in the Hebrew and in the English, so I know it wasn't there. Also, when my uncle, who also escaped with my parents, went to the United Jewish Appeal to ask for help, they said, you don't like it here, you can go back. So, I'm not denigrating anything you've said. I'm sure there are these nice dots you can connect around this country that did do things, but I don't think that it squelches this myth of silence. Because I grew up in this time too, and I was the only one who even knew about the Holocaust for decades.
Well, in a way, one can never speak to somebody else's personal memories.
But you're kind of denying that there was a myth of silence.
Well, in a sense, then it wouldn't be a myth. Then it would be a truth of silence. And yes, yes, because it wasn't true.
I'm saying, but I think a large part of it was.
Well, I mean,
in many parts, New York City, I understand when you said the 92nd Street Y and a dance and da-da-da. In big cities, I understand that maybe there was more happening because Jews could get together in groups in big cities. But in smaller towns, I'm talking 100,000, not like little baby towns, but there just wasn't.
Well, again, I can only talk about what exists in the records of the time. And so let me offer one example. In 1950, the Jews of Charleston, South Carolina, so we're not talking about a big community at all, celebrated the 200th anniversary of Jewish life in South Carolina. And they hired a playwright to come down from New York to stage a pageant on this 200 years of wonderful coexistence between the Jews and the state of South Carolina. And it was one of those texts that I was looking through, and I said, I'm not going to find anything about the Holocaust. How could there be anything about the Holocaust in this? Well, sure enough, the play that was written begins in a displaced persons camp. And there's a family, mother, father, 2 children, and the family meets in the play, meets a Jewish GI, and they say, where are you from? And he said, South Carolina. They say, South Carolina, never heard of South Carolina. And then we get the pageant, with the Revolutionary War soldiers and the Civil War soldiers and the costume dancers and the this and the that. And at each interval, after they finished a historical period, we're back on the stage with this family. They happened to be called the Schumans. And they commented on what they had just heard. And then the play ends back in the displaced persons camp, where the family says to the Jewish GI, what a wonderful place. I think if we go there, we too will find our place in the sun, which was the name of the play. Now, this play traveled across the state of South Carolina. Now, nobody made it up. I mean, that is, I saw the script. Okay, from 1950. Now, if one was a 3-year-old or a 5-year-old living in among a couple hundred Holocaust survivors who were resettled in South Carolina, would one remember that? I don't know. But the play took place. It began in a displaced persons camp. This family of survivors shows up after every act, at the beginning of every act.
By New York too, right?
No, it was South Carolina.
Oh, I said it was written by the
but the people of South Carolina, the Jews of South Carolina, endorsed this as their way to tell their white Christian neighbors, we have been here just as long as you have. And there was no reason to have that Holocaust family that survivor family in the play. I mean, it was kind of ridiculous, but it made it really powerful. And it was, to me, actually an example of how far down or wide geographically this was, and how this community, and this happened to be sponsored again by the Jewish Community Council of Charleston, wanted that story to be part of how they presented themselves to their neighbors. Okay. I think
I understand your talk is about Jews who were not involved, who were not affected by the Holocaust. Is it their silence or the people that was actually affected by it?
Okay, so that's a great question. And so for one thing, one might say that most American Jews were to some degree affected by it, because remember, this is a community made up of first and second generation immigrants. So for the first time in 1930, so the decade right before the Holocaust, for the first time, a slight majority of American Jews had been born in the United States. So that meant that nearly all parents and grandparents had come from the heartland of the Holocaust. I mean, they came from Poland, they came from primarily Lithuania, the Ukraine, which is where the slaughter took place in its most grotesque, and that's where most of the slaughter was. So they were affected. I mean, they didn't have family any longer back there. But the question of the survivors and their role is very interesting, because while on the one hand, we can understand that people who went through some traumatic, I mean, it was obviously incredibly traumatic ordeal, we could imagine that they were less than eager to talk. But yet, as early as 1953, the Jewish Book Annual, it's a book that came out every year documenting every Jewish book written in the United States. The editor of it said, there are so many memoirs that we will add a new section from now on called Churban Literatur, okay, the literature of the destruction. And these were memoirs, they were written in Yiddish, some of them were in English, most in Yiddish though. So people were talking about what had happened. These Warsaw Ghetto memorial programs, which again were Kansas City had one, Seattle had one, small, relatively small communities, Washington D.C. They all featured, what they would say, a new American who would get up to talk about what happened. Nearly all of these programs had 6 survivors light the ceremonial 6 candles. There was the beginnings of a sort of survivor commentary on on their ordeal. Sometimes they articulated a political position that was very different than the political position articulated by the mainstream American Jewish organizations. Okay, and let me just give an example. Throughout the 20th century, when there were demagogues, people like Henry Ford or Gerald L.K. Smith or Father Feeney in Boston, the American Jewish communal response had always been what they called quarantine. You don't talk about, you don't have a counter demonstration. You don't try to deny a permit to some anti-Semitic street speaker. Just let them fizzle out, because if you do anything, it's going to cause headlines, it's going to cause crowds, and that's exactly what they want. Now, it's not my position as a historian to say if that was the right or wrong strategy, but that was the American Jewish political response in the 20s, 30s, 40s, and through the 50s. In 1959, George Lincoln Rockwell created the American Nazi Party, and they had their they had their little stormtrooper outfits, and they requested parade permits in Boston, New York, and Washington. Indeed, they were going to parade to, it's very interesting, to disrupt the showing of the movie Exodus. Okay, and the Jewish community councils in all those cities said, we're just ignoring him. And the survivors said, absolutely not. And survivors would come to the meetings of the local Jewish community, again, the council, roll up their sleeves and say, look, I have the right to speak about this more than you do. Okay, and we have to go out and have a counter demonstration. Now, again, I'm not saying who's right or wrong, but the fact is they were there, they were organized, and they spoke from their experiences in a way that American Jews could only think of it in a kind of indirect manner. So they were there, they played a role in this evolving, growing Holocaust memorial culture.
I have a second question.
Just take one more, sorry, just one last question. We need a new question, I'm sorry. One last question.
Well, it's not complete. I couldn't finish my
You
question.
can follow up briefly, please.
So the real question is, this myth about silence, it's about people who were involved in the Holocaust. They couldn't talk about it to their children. It's an inside thing.
Well, that, in a way, I can't comment on. And I say someplace, and I could have said it here, we can't know what went on in people's homes. We have memoirs, we have, psychologists have studied it, but the historian is fundamentally unable to tap what went on at the dining room table. Did people talk about it or not? But we know what existed in the public sphere. We know who spoke at this gathering. We know who compiled the Yisker book. Okay, we know who, which Landsmannschaft built a memorial in which cemetery for their town. That's the public record, and that the historian can access. The private, what parents told children, what kids talk to each other about, I'm uncomfortable as a historian making statements about that because I don't have that data.
No, she's right.
Thank you. I was wondering, at what point did the Holocaust make it into become a normative element of Jewish school curricula?
Okay, that's great. Okay, so, it varied from school to school. As early as 1958, a Jewish educator named Isaac Frank in Washington, D.C., began to complain that kids were getting too inundated with this. And we said, we need to give them something positive and not constantly talking about, the catastrophe. So the Yiddish school textbooks, even while the war was still going on, had it. There was a magazine that all kids got called The World Over. It was a free magazine to Jewish school students, put out by the Jewish Education Society of North America, and it was full of stories about the Holocaust. In the mid-50s, the Reform movement published a 3-volume Jewish history textbook for probably middle school called The Adventures of the Jewish People. Okay, and in volume 3, there it was. Okay, so it became very, in a sense, it was never not there, and it was a matter of how much. And what one would want to do is also ask, what were the stories that were told? What was the message? And so that the Deborah Pessin 3-volume really focused on heroism. Okay, and no matter how terrible things were, they stood up, they fought. Whereas the Yiddish materials were much more. So even, by the way, that little story of Mr. Kudlowitz, it was an arbitering school. So obviously the kids at that school were learning it because they did their memorial program at the school. So, but to track it and to see how it changed and how it grew is obviously a really interesting and very doable historical project.
I want to thank Hasia for